London, in the year 1666, was a city both fragile and proud. The medieval streets were narrow, winding like veins through a body of timber and thatch. Wooden houses leaned toward each other as if in conversation, their upper floors stretching across the cobbled roads until the sun could barely break through. It was a city alive with trade, gossip, and hope, but also one resting on a knife's edge, vulnerable to disaster. This was a London only recently scarred by another enemy, the Great Plague of 1665. That terrible pestilence had carried away tens of thousands, leaving behind empty homes and a lingering fear in every soul who had survived. People longed for stability, for normal life to return. But they had no idea that another catastrophe, perhaps even greater, was waiting just around the corner. It all began on the night of September 2nd, 1666, in a small bakery on Pudding Lane, owned by a man named Thomas Fariner. A simple place filled with flour, dust, and the warmth of ovens. It was no different from dozens of other bakeries across the city. But that night, something went wrong. Perhaps a spark fell from the oven. Perhaps a pile of firewood was left too close to the heat. Whatever the cause, flames caught and grew, first licking the wood beams, then surging upward with terrifying speed. Londoners were no strangers to fire. It was a constant risk in a city built largely of timber. But fires usually broke out, burned a few houses, and were quickly contained. This one, however, was different. The summer had been long and dry, leaving the city's wooden heart brittle as tinder. And on that particular night, the wind was fierce, blowing from the east with a restless hunger. The flames that started in Fariner's bakery leapt eagerly from one building to the next, feeding on wood, pitch, and thatch. Within hours, the fire was out of control. At first, people were slow to react. Londoners were used to the occasional blaze, and many thought this too would soon pass. Some even stood in the streets watching the orange glow rise in the night sky, not realizing that what they saw was the beginning of a nightmare. By dawn, however, the truth could not be ignored. The fire had spread beyond Pudding Lane. It roared through Fish Street, devoured houses, and reached warehouses filled with oil, pitch, and alcohol materials that turned the blaze into a monstrous inferno. Flames rose higher than church spires. Smoke blotted out the sun, and the heat was so intense that it cracked stone and melted lead from the rooftops. Panic set in. Families scrambled to save what little they could, carrying bundles of clothes, bedding, and even furniture through the crowded streets. Some loaded their possessions onto carts, only to have thieves snatch them away in the chaos. Others simply fled with nothing, their homes left to burn. The Lord Mayor of London at the time, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was summoned as the fire grew. He had the authority to order drastic measures, such as demolishing houses to create fire breaks. But he hesitated. He looked at the burning homes and famously muttered, "Pish. A woman could piss it out." That arrogance, that delay, proved disastrous. For every moment wasted, the fire gathered strength. And so the inferno marched on. Churches, markets, and homes all fell victim. The wind carried burning embers through the air, igniting new blazes wherever they landed. People rushed to the River Thames, thinking the water might save them. Boats filled with frightened families pushed off, while others waded into the river, clutching children and belongings. The Thames became both a refuge and a mirror, reflecting the city's agony in the waves of firelight. Among the most haunting sights were the churches. London was a city of spires, each one a symbol of faith and stability. But the fire showed no mercy. St. Magnus the Martyr, St. Dunstan's, and dozens more went up in flames, their bells melting and crashing down in molten torrents. The air was filled with the sound of roaring fire, screaming people, and the terrible groan of collapsing timbers. By the end of the first day, London was already transformed. Thousands of people were homeless. Streets were clogged with smoke and ash. The smell of burning wood, tar, and flesh filled the air. And yet the fire was only beginning its reign of terror. What made the Great Fire so terrifying was not just its destruction, but the sense of helplessness it created. In a world without modern fire engines, without organized fire brigades, ordinary people were left with buckets, hooks, and sheer desperation. They fought, but the fire was stronger. It leapt over barriers, consumed entire parishes, and seemed almost alive, an unstoppable beast feeding on the very heart of London. As night fell on September 2nd, the city glowed like a furnace. The flames were visible for miles, a terrible beacon drawing the eyes of those in the countryside. Inside London, fear turned to despair. Where could one run when the fire seemed to chase you at every turn? Where could one hide when the very air burned in your lungs? And so, with the fire raging and no end in sight, Londoners braced themselves for a second day of horror. The Great Fire had begun, and it would not rest until it had left its mark on history forever. The morning of September 3rd, 1666, dawned not with hope, but with dread. Londoners who had survived the first night awoke to a city already half lost. What had begun as a spark in a bakery was now a raging inferno stretching across parishes, chewing up neighborhoods with a hunger that seemed endless. The fire had grown too vast to fight. The makeshift methods, lines of people passing buckets of water, men tearing at burning timbers with hooks, women dashing into the smoke with wet blankets, were pitiful against the scale of destruction. Flames leapt high above rooftops, carried by the eastern wind, while embers rained down on distant streets, igniting new fires before the old ones could even be approached. In those hours, the city itself seemed to turn against its people. Houses built of oak and pitch, warehouses stocked with coal, wool, and brandy olive fed the blaze. Narrow streets became chimneys, funneling flames upward with a roar. Bridges became traps, with fire on one side and choking smoke on the other. For the ordinary Londoner, survival became a frantic, personal battle. Imagine a family stumbling through the smoke-filled streets, a father dragging a cart piled with bedding, a mother clutching a child to her chest, older sons carrying whatever food or tools they could manage. Around them, the cries of neighbors echoed shouts for lost children, screams of terror, prayers for deliverance. At every corner, they were confronted with walls of fire that forced them to turn back, to seek new routes, to abandon what little they had saved. The riverbanks became scenes of chaos. People rushed to the Thames, hoping it might be their salvation. Boats crowded with families pushed off in panic while others waded into the water, clutching bundles of clothes or sacks of grain above their heads. The river that had long been London's lifeblood now became its only refuge. By the second day, even the wealthiest citizens were not spared. Mansions crumbled alongside hovels. Merchant warehouses filled with exotic goods from across the seas exploded in flame. In Cheapside, once the proud center of London's trade, silks, spices, and sugar burned in a furious symphony of color and smoke. The fire also carried a more sinister consequence. Suspicion, rumors began to spread as quickly as the flames. Some whispered that the French had set the fire as an act of war. Others claimed it was the Dutch, England's rivals on the seas. Still more muttered of Catholics and conspirators, fanning old prejudices and fears. In the panic of the moment, mobs formed, and innocent foreigners were attacked in the streets, beaten or nearly lynched by angry crowds who wanted anyone to blame. Meanwhile, the city's leaders scrambled for solutions. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, had proven weak and indecisive. His refusal to order the demolition of houses early on had sealed the city's fate. Now the responsibility shifted upward to King Charles II himself. Charles, only in his mid-30s, was a king remembered for charm and wit, but in these terrible days, he showed another side: determination. Alongside his brother James, Duke of York, he rode into the city to direct firefighting efforts personally. He ordered soldiers to tear down houses, finally creating the fire breaks that the Lord Mayor had been too timid to sanction. But by the time this decision came, the flames were already far ahead. The night of September 3rd, the fire reached new horrors. St. Paul's Cathedral, the great symbol of London's faith and resilience, stood in its path. For centuries, its mighty stone walls and towering spire had been the pride of the city. Many believed it would survive, for how could fire consume stone? Inside, printers and booksellers had stored thousands of volumes, thinking the cathedral's strength would keep them safe. But St. Paul's was no match for the inferno, as the scaffolding around it, left from ongoing repairs, caught fire first, and the flames climbed higher and higher until the great roof itself was ablaze. Witnesses later wrote of how the lead from the roof ran down in rivers, glowing red and white in the firelight. The mighty bells melted and fell with a thunderous crash. Within hours, St. Paul's, once the heart of London, was a smoldering ruin. For Londoners, the destruction of St. Paul's was more than just the loss of a building. It was a spiritual blow. If even God's house could not withstand the flames, what hope was left for the rest of the city? People wept openly in the streets as they watched its collapse, the orange glow lighting their faces through smoke and tears. By September 4th, the fire raged with unrelenting fury. From the Tower of London to Fleet Street, whole swaths of the city had vanished into ash. The heat was so intense that people could not get near enough to fight it. Eyewitnesses spoke of the ground itself being too hot to walk upon, of stone walls exploding from within, of glass windows shattering into molten drops. And even amid the terror, there were acts of quiet bravery. Priests carried sacred vessels out of burning churches, refusing to let them be consumed. Merchants guided neighbors to safety, abandoning their own goods. Mothers calmed their children with whispered promises, though they themselves trembled with fear. It was not just the city that burned, it was the lives, the memories, the very identity of its people. Generations of homes, family heirlooms, documents, and treasures vanished in smoke. Every street lost something. Every parish bore scars. By now, the fire stretched across nearly 2 miles of the city. Entire districts were unrecognizable, nothing but charred ruins. The skyline that once bristled with church spires and wooden gables was now a jagged line of smoke and flame. And yet, as the fire devoured more of London, a strange resilience began to stir among its people. The king's presence gave some a sense of order, a reminder that they were not abandoned. Soldiers and civilians alike began to work together, pulling down buildings with ropes and axes, even as the flames licked at their heels. Slowly, painfully, they carved out gaps that the fire could not cross. Still, the destruction was staggering. By the night of September 4th, over 13,000 houses had been reduced to rubble. Dozens of churches lay in ruins. Hundreds of shops and businesses were gone. The city that had stood for centuries was collapsing in just a matter of days. And yet the fire still burned on, greedy and unrelenting. Londoners asked themselves the same question, whispered over and over amid the smoke. When will it end? The answer would not come until the 4th day. But first, the fire would demand yet more sacrifices. By the morning of September 5th, 1666, London was a ghost of its former self. The flames still burned, but at last, the furious winds that had fanned them began to die down. What fire breaks the soldiers and citizens had carved out started to hold, starving the blaze of fuel. For the first time in 4 long days, there was a glimmer of hope. The fire was finally losing its strength. That day, exhausted Londoners staggered through the ruins, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes hollow with grief. They had endured a nightmare that seemed unending nights, lit by orange skies, days filled with the roar of collapsing walls and the cries of the desperate. Now, at last, the worst was over. But the price was staggering. When the fire was finally extinguished, the scale of destruction became clear. Over 13,000 houses were gone. Nearly 90 churches were destroyed. Countless businesses, inns, schools, and workshops had vanished. In total, 4/5 of the medieval city lay in ruins. Whole districts had simply ceased to exist. Pudding Lane, where it had begun, was now nothing but ash. Cheapside, once bustling with merchants, was reduced to rubble. Even mighty St. Paul's Cathedral was a hollow shell, its blackened stones standing like broken teeth against the sky. And yet, amid this devastation, there was a strange, haunting silence. For though tens of thousands had lost their homes, relatively few had lost their lives. Contemporary reports spoke of fewer than a dozen deaths, though historians suspect the true number was higher. Many poor and unrecorded may have perished in the flames, their remains reduced to ash and never counted. Still, compared to the scale of destruction, the survival of so many was almost miraculous. That did not make their suffering less. Homeless families camped in fields outside the city walls, in Moorfields, Finsbury, and Islington. Tents, makeshift shelters, and scattered belongings filled the meadows. The once proud citizens of London now lived as refugees, staring at the smoke still rising from the place they had called home. The king himself visited the camps, promising aid and relief. Bread and food were distributed, though never enough. For many, hunger and despair became their new companions. The city's poor, already burdened before the fire, now bore the heaviest weight, and still whispers of blame filled the air. People demanded answers. Who had caused this? At first, Thomas Fariner the baker was accused. His shop had been the spark, but he swore he had extinguished the ovens before bed. He and his family had escaped only by climbing through an upstairs window. Others turned their anger outward, blaming foreigners or religious minorities. In one tragic case, a Frenchman named Robert Hubert confessed falsely to starting the fire. Though his story made little sense, he was tried, condemned, and executed. His death served as a grim scapegoat for a city desperate for someone to punish. But the truth was simpler and more cruel. The fire had not been the work of spies or saboteurs. It had been London itself, a city built of wood and pitch, crammed into narrow lanes, waiting for disaster. All it had needed was a spark and a strong wind. For King Charles II, the fire was both a crisis and an opportunity. He knew London must be rebuilt, not simply restored. Plans poured in from architects and visionaries. Some dreamed of wide boulevards like Paris with orderly squares and stone buildings. Sir Christopher Wren, a brilliant young architect, proposed bold designs with broad streets and grand vistas, centered on a new St. Paul's Cathedral. But dreams are costly, and the city's merchants and landowners were impatient. They wanted their businesses back, their homes restored, their profits resumed. In the end, practicality triumphed over vision. London was rebuilt largely on the same medieval footprint, but with crucial changes. Houses were to be built of brick and stone, not timber. Streets were widened in some places, and fire regulations were introduced to prevent such devastation again. Still, from the ashes rose wonders. Christopher Wren would indeed rebuild St. Paul's, crafting the magnificent dome that still defines London's skyline today. Dozens of parish churches rose again under his hand, elegant and resilient. The city, though scarred, began to breathe once more. For the people, however, the scars ran deeper. The Great Fire was not merely a physical disaster, it was a wound in their sense of security, a reminder of how fragile life was in their world. Only a year earlier, the plague had stalked the streets, carrying off friends and family. How fire had consumed their homes. To live in London in the 1660s was to live with constant reminders of mortality and loss. And yet, there was resilience too. Londoners are nothing if not stubborn. From the ashes of their homes, they began to rebuild. Merchants reopened shops and temporary stalls. Families salvaged bricks and stones to start again. The same spirit that had endured plague now faced fire, refusing to let it be the end of their city. In time, the Great Fire would become more than a tragedy, it would become a turning point. It forced London to modernize, to shed its medieval skin, and step into a new age. It gave birth to new architecture, new safety laws, new ways of thinking about cities. It left behind a story told for generations, a warning and a lesson about human pride, vulnerability, and survival. Even centuries later, standing in the heart of modern London, it is possible to feel the echo of those terrible days. Walk near Pudding Lane, where a small monument marks the fire's beginning, and you can almost hear the crackle of flames. The shouts of terrified families, the tolling of church bells before they melted into silence. Stand beneath the dome of St. Paul's, and you are reminded of the phoenix-like rebirth that followed the ashes. The Great Fire of 1666 was not the end of London. It was, in a strange way, a beginning. Out of smoke and ruin, a new city rose, one that would go on to endure wars, bombs, and the march of centuries. But in September of 1666, none of that was certain. For those who lived through it, it was simply terror. Imagine standing in a street lit only by fire, the air choking with smoke, your home collapsing into cinders and wondering if the city you knew would ever exist again. That was the reality of the Great Fire, a city humbled, a people tested, a story that still flickers like embers in the memory of London's history. The Great Fire of London was more than just a disaster, it was a human story. It was fear, loss, anger, and resilience. It was a reminder of how fragile civilization can be, and how quickly life can change in the face of nature's fury. And yet, it was also proof of endurance. Out of the ashes came renewal. Out of despair came determination. The fire destroyed a city, but it did not destroy its people. That is why, more than 3 centuries later, we still remember those 4 terrible days in September 1666, when London burned and when London was reborn.